He lay burning in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, unable to speak or rise. The greatest conqueror the world had ever known was dying. His name was Alexander of Macedon. At 32, he had conquered more of the known world than any man before him. His empire had no heir. But to understand how the boy who tamed an untamable horse came to die in a foreign palace, we must go back to the beginning. In the 4th century before Christ, Macedonia was a rugged kingdom dismissed by Athens and Sparta as little better than barbarian. Then came Philip II. In a single generation, he rebuilt Macedonia into the most feared military power in the Greek world, bending his neighbors to his will. Athens had built democracy. Sparta had built warriors. Thebes had shattered Sparta's myth of invincibility. These were the people who called themselves civilized. All would kneel. Far to the east lay the greatest empire the ancient world had seen. Persia stretched from the Aegean to India, with wealth beyond anything Greece could imagine. For a century and a half, Greece and Persia had clashed in wars that shaped history. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. That wound had never healed. Philip II dreamed of avenging Greece against Persia. He assembled the League of Corinth, planned the invasion, and trained an army worthy of the task. Into this world of ambition, prophecy, and unfinished war, a child was born. The priests and the omens agreed this was no ordinary prince. On July 20th, 356 BC, Philip won a battle. His chariot won at Olympia, and in Pella a boy was born who would outshine them both. His mother Olympias was fierce, deeply religious, and terrifying. She slept with sacred serpents and whispered that his true father was not Philip, but Zeus. From childhood, Alexander burned with a competitive fury that unsettled even his father. When Philip won a battle, the boy sulked, afraid nothing would be left to conquer. When Alexander was 13, Philip summoned Aristotle to tutor his son. For 3 years at Mieza, the greatest philosopher alive shaped the mind that would reshape the world. Aristotle gave Alexander Homer's Iliad, annotated by hand. Alexander slept with it for life. He learned that great men do not merely inherit the world, they remake it. A black stallion had thrown every rider. Young Alexander noticed it feared its own shadow. He turned it toward the sun, mounted it, and rode it home. Philip wept. At 16, left to rule while Philip campaigned, Alexander crushed a Thracian rebellion, founded a city on its ruins, and named it Alexandropolis, his first. At Chaeronea in 338 BC, Philip gave his 18-year-old son command of the elite cavalry wing. Alexander shattered the sacred band of Thebes into pieces. 300 men destroyed. 2 years later, at his daughter's wedding, Philip was stabbed by his own bodyguard. The motive was never established. Alexander was king at 20. Alexander moved fast. Rivals disappeared. Conspirators were executed. Enemies were neutralized before they could act. He secured his kingdom before his father's blood had dried. When Thebes rebelled, Alexander marched south in 2 weeks and erased it. 6,000 killed, 30,000 enslaved. Only the temples survived. Greece fell silent. The League of Corinth named him supreme commander of an army of 37,000. He was preparing for something no Greek had ever successfully attempted. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia, hurled his spear into the Persian shore, and leaped onto the beach. He claimed Asia as his own. He never looked back. At the Granicus River, Persian cavalry held the far bank. Alexander plunged in himself and nearly died when a blade cracked his helmet. The Persians were routed. In Gordium, prophecy said whoever untied the ancient knot would rule all Asia. Alexander studied it, drew his sword, and cut straight through it. The legend accepted the answer. As Alexander swept south, he liberated Greek city after city. He restored their democracies, refused to loot them, and presented himself not as conqueror, but as liberator. At Issus in 333 BC, Alexander faced Darius III and an army 3 times his size. Within hours, the Persian king had fled, abandoning his mother, wife, and children. Darius's mother bowed before the wrong man in the captured tent. When corrected, she wept. Alexander told her not to worry. He treated the Persian royal family with honor. Tyre refused to surrender. Alexander built a causeway 2 miles into the sea to reach it. 7 months later, when it fell, he crucified 2,000 along the shore. Egypt surrendered without a battle. The Persians had been despised occupiers. Alexander was welcomed as a liberator, crowned pharaoh, and walked the sacred temples as one of their own. In 331 BC, Alexander crossed the desert to the oracle at Siwa. What the priest told him, he kept secret. He returned to his army a different man. On the Egyptian coast, Alexander marked a new city in the sand using grain. He named it Alexandria. It would outlast everything else he ever built. At Gaugamela, on October 1st, 331 BC, Alexander opened a gap in his own line and drove his cavalry straight for Darius. The Persian king fled. Again, Persepolis fell without resistance. Alexander seized its treasury, requiring 10,000 mules to carry. Then, one night, in 330 BC, it burned. Whether revenge or accident, Persia's heart was ash. Darius fled and was murdered by his own general. Alexander found the body on a Bactrian road and covered it with his cloak. He ordered a full state funeral. He was 26 and had destroyed the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. The boy from Macedonia was now master of everything that had ever mattered. Alexander did not stop. Bessus had declared himself king. Alexander marched into the mountains of Bactria to hunt him down. The hardest years of his life were beginning. Drunk at a banquet in 328 BC, Alexander killed his oldest general, Cleitus, in a rage. Cleitus had once saved his life. Alexander wept for 3 days. Bactria refused to be conquered as Persia had been. Villages disappeared into mountains. For the first time, Alexander faced enemies he could not defeat by destroying their army. In a Bactrian fortress, Alexander met Roxane, a local nobleman's daughter, and married her. She was his only legal wife. Whether love or strategy, the marriage changed the region. Alexander began demanding the Persian act of full prostration from everyone who approached him. His Macedonian veterans refused. To them, it was abasement. The court split in two. In 327 BC, royal pages plotted to murder Alexander in his sleep. The conspiracy was uncovered. The pages were executed. Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, died in captivity. Paranoia had settled permanently. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush in winter and descended into India. His men had been at war for 10 years. They kept marching because he asked them to. At the Hydaspes, King Porus waited with war elephants. Alexander crossed the flooded river at night in a monsoon. His cavalry routed them. He had never respected an enemy more. Bucephalus, who had carried Alexander from Macedonia to the edge of the world, died near the Hydaspes. Alexander founded a city there and named it Bucephala. At the Hephaestion River, his army refused to march further. 10 years of war. Alexander raged and sulked for 3 days. For the only time, he turned back. The return through the Gedrosian Desert became a catastrophe. The heat was merciless. Water disappeared. Thousands died in the sand. Survivors buried them and kept walking. Nearchus had sailed the Persian Gulf, mapping coastlines no Greek had ever seen. When he stood before Alexander again, both men wept. Each had believed the other was dead. In October 324 BC, Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion since childhood, fell ill with fever at Ecbatana. He ignored his physician and drank heavily. Within a week, he was dead. Alexander cut his hair in mourning and had the sacred Persian flame extinguished. He spent 10,000 talents building Hephaestion, a funeral pyre 60 meters tall. Chaldean priests warned Alexander not to enter Babylon. Omens foretold his death inside its walls. He circled the city and entered from the west, the setting sun behind him. At Susa, Alexander had married Statira, Darius's daughter, while 90 of his officers took Persian brides in a single ceremony. He was trying to fuse 2 worlds into one. In his final months, Alexander drank heavily and grew erratic. Officers were threatened. Allies fell under suspicion. He looked like a man who had run out of world. On June 1st, 323 BC, Alexander drank through the night at a banquet in Babylon. By morning, he had collapsed. Within 11 days, he would be dead. He died on June 10th, 323 BC, in Babylon, 32 years old. The probable cause was typhoid. When asked who should inherit his empire, he answered, "The strongest." His generals tore the empire apart. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus the east, Antigonus the west. The wars of the successors consumed 40 years. The empire died with its builder. Alexander had wished to be buried at Siwa. Ptolemy intercepted the funeral cortege and brought the body to Egypt. Julius Caesar and Augustus both made pilgrimages to his tomb. What he left behind was a world remade. Greek language and philosophy spread from the Mediterranean to India. The cities he founded became centers of learning that lasted centuries. After his death, Alexander became more myth than man. Romans worshipped him. Islamic scholars called him Dul Qarnayn. Medieval Europeans made him a saint. Nations still argue about who he was. He lived 32 years and never lost a battle. He built a world that could not survive him. History has not since produced anyone quite like him.